hello, everybody. I'm Gabriel Metcalf with the Committee for Sydney, and welcome to the next installment of Committee for Sydney Live. Our topic today is London and what this pandemic means for London. We are having some technical issues with our speakers. We have 2 out of 3 online right now, but we want to keep to our time. So we are going to make the best of it, and hopefully we will get to 3 out of 3. So by way of introduction, look, we all understand that London is one of the cities in the world that has been hit the hardest by COVID-19. I believe the numbers are around at least 5,000 Londoners have died so far. So it's one of the greatest cities in the world. Most people from Sydney have, of course, been to London at some point. The historical ties remain important. I was in London twice in 2019. Ben Rogers was nice enough to be my host and guide for one of those. And London continues to be one of the most influential cities on Sydney for all the obvious reasons, both historical and current. So our hearts have really gone out to London. We are really grateful to all of you for making time to talk with us. It is, of course, very early in London as well, at 7 a.m. So our plan was to kick this off with Ben Rogers, who directs the Center for London. We actually brought Ben out to Sydney last year. We're probably going to start instead with our next 2 speakers, Rachael Robathan, who has been leader of Westminster City Council since January of this year. She had previously held the cabinet member portfolios for finance, property, and regeneration, as well as housing and adults and public health. As well, we are joined by Stuart, who is the chief executive of the Westminster City Council. Previously, he headed up the Council City Management and Communities Department and has had senior positions in various other boroughs as well. So we have some very thoughtful observers and participants about London. Let's go ahead. We will, if Ben is able to join, we will fit him in, but let's go ahead and get started. And Rachael, I think we'll ask you to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, and indeed thank you very much for asking us to join you. We're delighted. It might be early in the morning, but it's great to be talking to colleagues in Sydney at this time, and isn't this a wonderful factor of modern technology that we're able to do this? And as I was saying earlier, I promise you the sun is shining here in London at the moment. So what I thought I would do is perhaps if I start off by giving a little bit of context to what's happening in London, then I was going to suggest that Stuart talks a little bit about how we're actually operating through this. And maybe I would then, before we open up to questions for you, perhaps I could just give a few thoughts about how we in Westminster are thinking about where we go from here, how we actually recover and ease lockdown. So, Gabriel, as you said in your introduction, this has been very tough for the whole of the UK, but particularly for a city like Westminster, where lockdown has hit us like a train. And the normally bustling streets, it could almost break your heart. If you looked out of the window now, you would see nothing on the streets. And normally, as you know, everyone who visits London, it is a 24/7 city. And it is, you know, there's colour, there's life, there's everything going on. It's just a wonderful melting pot bringing everyone together. And at the moment, there is nothing happening out there. As you know, Westminster sits right at the heart of the capital. So we are home to the busiest and biggest nighttime entertainment sector in the country. Many of you might have sampled that. We're also home to Buckingham Palace, the government, a host of cultural and really iconic and important heritage institutions. We have 250,000 residents, and here's one of the challenges for Westminster. Our population rises by 1 million, an additional 1 million every day, as we have tourists and people coming to work in Westminster. Westminster, as you know, huge driver of the British economy. We account for just under 10% of the entire country's business rates. So that's a huge amount of the entire country's business driver is here in Westminster, which is a big thing. So as well as hosting the biggest nighttime entertainment sector, we also are the driver for the British economy. And so what's happened since the pandemic? Well, as I mentioned, things have really just pretty much dropped off a cliff. There has been very widespread support for the lockdown and understanding of the need for it. So people have complied with very few exceptions. Although the police have been enforcing, it's been able to be very light touch. But I'd just highlight a few particular challenges, apart from the obvious ones about how we help our businesses through this. So the first one, and you probably don't have this to anything like the extent in Sydney, but we have always had an acute problem with rough sleepers in Westminster. We spend almost £10 million a year in services to help rough sleepers off the streets. We have outreach workers out there 24/7 in normal circumstances. So one of the things during this period across the country, but particularly Westminster, has been how we get people off the streets rapidly, because with their underlying health conditions, particularly about 2/3 of rough sleepers have respiratory conditions, how we can safely accommodate people. So we have housed an additional about 450 people, 250 in hotel accommodation within Westminster, and then an additional 200 out of Westminster, but just next door. So that's a huge number of additional people that we have housed in temporary, i.e. hotel accommodation. And that raises a big challenge for us in terms of what happens post-lockdown, because obviously that accommodation will be not sustainable. The hotels will want to reclaim their accommodation, and we need to, with government, look at how we deal with that. So that is a big piece of work which we are all very much focused on, and working very closely with central government on this. It's happening across all London boroughs, but it's particularly acute in Westminster, but it represents a real challenge. Another thing that I wanted to just raise in particular in the context of Westminster is how we deal with our parks. You know, we are a very densely inhabited city. We have a lot of people living in high-rise developments, so it's been really important that we maintain some kind of space for people. The rules in Britain are that you can go to work if it's absolutely necessary, and you cannot work from home, but otherwise you are only allowed to have 1 hour of exercise a day. And now imagine if you're a young mother with 2 children living on the 20th floor of a block of flats in Westminster, of which we have very, very many. Your 1 hour is absolutely a lifeline. And so it's always been really important for us that we have to keep the parks open. There's been a lot of pressure to close them because of concerns around social distancing and how people keep their space. We've seen people being arrested for sunbathing. We've had all sorts of debates about whether or not it's allowed to sit on a park bench. A lot of people saying that we should remove or tape off all the park benches. And we said, well, hang on, what about if you're an 85-year-old who wants to go for a walk, but needs to have a rest part of the way through your walk? So we have kept the parks open, and they are the heart and lungs of our city and a real lifeline for people. So that's been something else that's been really important. So before I give a few thoughts about how we go from here, perhaps I should ask Stuart to talk about how we've kept running as a city.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And good afternoon, and as Rachel said, thank you very much for having us with you today. Just to give you a bit of a sense of what's happened in London and Westminster since lockdown. In effect, when lockdown was announced, that meant that London moved into an emergency response mode. And that means that we have a London-wide structure in place that is overseeing the response of all public authorities in London. So that would be local authorities, police, health, fire and rescue, etc. And from a council's point of view, we've also gone into a similar emergency response mode. We've had a strong focus on what are the critical services that we need to be delivering to our communities and all of our communities in the current situation. For us, that's meant adult social care in particular, and local authorities in the UK have slightly different responsibilities to those in Australia. So from an adult social care perspective, that is our responsibility for vulnerable people in our communities, and in particular care homes. And care homes are being hit hard by the virus in terms of deaths. So we've been working very closely with our providers, our own frontline staff, ensuring that we have appropriate levels of personal protective equipment for people. Currently, there's a really big focus on testing, and that may lead to some work being done around contact tracing, which we might talk about as part of the recovery element. Children's services, again, with the lockdown, schools have closed, and that means that we have less contact or direct contact with vulnerable children, which is a concern for us. So we have enhanced the level of service we're providing in that area and reaching out to children and families in different ways to which we might have before, using technology much more. We've delivered laptops and iPads both to young people but also to older people in Westminster so that they can stay connected with their families, with their loved ones, but also so that as a council we can remain connected with those people who really do need our help and support. Across London, we've had to, in response to this, stand up a range of mortality management arrangements. And in essence, what that means is London local government has built a lot of temporary mortuary capacity. So basically, we've doubled the mortuary capacity in London, which I appreciate is a slightly morbid subject to be talking about, but nevertheless, it is something that has been very important. The good news is that that capacity has not had to be used, which means that at the moment, the flattening of the peak and the managing of the virus and the infection rate, particularly in terms of the impact in hospitals and care homes, it seems to be working. Rachel's already mentioned rough sleepers. I won't go into that again. But one of the absolutely key things for us right at the outset of this, when we started looking at what were our critical services, how we resourced those, how we made sure that they were resilient, and I mentioned communities, our business community is obviously hugely important. And again, Rachel's already spoken about the business rates take. In Westminster, we generate more GDP for the country than any other part of the country, in any other local authority area. And we take that responsibility incredibly seriously. And what we also knew with the impact of coronavirus on business was that we were going to be asked to, in essence, administer the government's grant scheme, the relief that's been provided to business. So we, again, right at the outset of all of this, we put additional resource into our revenues and benefits team, and that's the team that makes these payments. And I'm glad to say that we are, in terms of what's happening across the country, as a local authority, we are getting more money out of the door and making sure that more businesses are supported than any other part of the country at the moment, which is absolutely right given our responsibility in that area. And in particular, I know we'll come on to speak to this shortly, but it's not just about the immediate response, it's about what happens in the medium to long term to the economy, which is hugely important to us and has an impact clearly on our residents, on jobs, etc. I think it's also probably important to say that we, in Westminster, there's always a lot of construction activity that goes on, and that has remained working during the lockdown. There's been lots of guidance provided to businesses and construction companies in terms of how to carry out construction safely with social distancing. And what we're seeing, whilst the number of sites did close down at the very beginning of the lockdown, over the last 2 weeks in particular, we've seen more and more coming back on stream. And that does help in terms of getting more people back into work. Housing and homes and affordable homes, hugely important for us. So we've very much supported the construction industry continuing throughout the lockdown. And then if I can just give you a bit of a sense of what it's like in Westminster and in London at the moment, and Rachael's already mentioned the streets are deserted and it's quite surreal out there at the moment. We employ 2,500 people, and in the building we're sat in at the moment, on a normal pre-coronavirus day, there would be about 1,600 people in this building. Today, you'll find about 30 of us in the building. Everybody else is working from home. We have on average about 1,800 people a day sign into our systems remotely. And then the balance will include a lot of our frontline staff who are out there in our communities, helping to assist vulnerable people, but also ensuring the city keeps running, ensuring that refuse is collected, etc. So I should just say our staff, and by and large staff across London in all local authorities, have been outstanding in the face of this pandemic. Committed, dedicated, and the city has kept running as it would, or as it should in the context of the pandemic. But we are all working very differently, and the vast majority of London is, or Londoners people who work in London are working from home. And if you use Westminster as a microcosm of that, it'll be 90+% of people are currently working from home and not actually coming into London. And our current focus, and there's a lot of work being done on this, and we're thinking about how we structure ourselves to look at this going forward, is very much on the easing and exiting of lockdown and what that means in the short, medium, and long term. But I know Rachael wants to talk about that now, so I'll stop there and hand back to Rachael.
Well, that's a good point at which to switch back, and let's perhaps it would be good to focus on a few things that we're looking at and that we're thinking about to perhaps direct the way in terms of when we come on to questions. So as Stuart said, we have two things we're really focusing on now. One is the exiting the lockdown strategy, which is the first and the major piece. And the second is how we support the renewal or recovery, however we like to call it. We're talking about a renaissance of our city, of Westminster. So first, in the lockdown strategy, clearly there's a huge amount going on in that piece in terms of, I've already mentioned the rough sleeper contingent that we have, that cohort, which is a particularly vulnerable cohort, and we have to have a program in place for how we help assist people into housing or onward journeys, help them to get home. We have a huge amount of foreign people also that we're housing, particularly from Eastern Europe, in our accommodation. So how can we help them to get home if that's appropriate or whatever. So that's a large part of it, but also how we begin to ease the city back into life, ease our own staff back into life. And it won't necessarily be the same as before. In fact, it's very unlikely to be the same as before. We have found new ways of working. We're all able to work really efficiently in the new ways. So it won't necessarily be the case that on day one post-lockdown that we'll suddenly have City Hall fully staffed again. In fact, I think that's extremely unlikely. We'll be easing our way back into working. But for the city as well, there is an issue about how do we help to encourage people to come back into the city of Westminster to drive our economy, which is so important. So we are looking at ways of whether we can temporarily make pedestrian areas better, wider, pavement widening, so that people can actually observe social distancing while still walking around particularly the retail areas, which will open up. Some of our iconic shopping areas, Regent Street, Oxford Street, Bond Street, which you'll know very well. How do we make those accessible for people when they're still highly concerned about the virus still post-lockdown? There's clearly huge challenges. I won't even go near the financial challenge, which this is posing for all of us, but you'll be well aware of it. But let me talk actually about some of the opportunities. Let's end on a slightly more constructive note, because there have been some really interesting things that have come out of this. So first of all, one of the first things that we did as a city was to set up a volunteering platform. We call it Westminster Connects. And that has so far had over 3,000 people registered on it as volunteers. And that's a tremendous effort. And they're doing a whole variety of things, delivering meals, doing personal shopping, sewing masks for hospitals, driving people around. There's been a huge amount of things going on, and that volunteering platform is something that we can absolutely build on. We've actually just rolled out Westminster Connect's local shopping, which is a way of showing the offer that local businesses, local shops have, and local restaurants on our website so that people know what's available in their area. So it's a way of helping residents signpost them to how they can get meals or any other services locally, what's still open, what's still operating. But also it's a way of helping our small businesses, keeping them on their feet so that there will still be a high street when we come out of this. The next bit is around communication, and we have been really, in Westminster, as I know of other areas, been really focused on how we effectively communicate with all sorts of groups during this. If I tell you that just in the city of Westminster, just for Westminster, we send out a daily email to 140,000 people, 140,000 people. So we started off, we had 50,000 on our website. Because of the raising of GDPR issues, data protection around because of the public health crisis, we were able to expand that to everyone on our council tax and business rates list. It went up to 150,000. We thought that we'd have a massive amount of people unsubscribing. In fact, we've had only 10,000 unsubscribe, and we have a daily open rate of 30%, which is just extraordinary. So 140,000 emails going out every day with an open rate of 30%. We've also set up a number of stakeholder groups, meetings, for want of a better term, a meeting with different segments of community, and that's because we want to be working with people so that we can coordinate and align in a much more effective way. So, for example, we have a meeting every fortnight with the major landowners in great estates, as we call it, in Westminster. So these are people who are really the landowners of businesses and residential, but with us have a real stake in the long-term future of this community. We have a fortnightly meeting with the Business Improvement District, so those supporting businesses, with resident amenity societies. And all of these are going to be really important as we move forward into the next recovery renewal phase, how we work with those groups to really look at projects that we can deliver forward. So I think both on the communication side and on the volunteering side, Westminster Connects, we have a real legacy which we can build on. And ultimately, it is going to be very much a joint effort, how we drive recovery in our city. And central to that also is going to be those with able to take a long-term view, like us as the City of Westminster, but also the great estates, the likes of Grosvenor, the Crown, all of those landowners which have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years and able to take a long-term view, how we all come together and work together to invest in our city to drive growth again. So things like, you may be aware of the plans, we have very ambitious plans around Oxford Street. That is going to be for the renewal of Oxford Street. That scheme, for example, is going to be a really important driver, not only of Westminster's growth, but also for the country. If you take into account what we were saying earlier about Westminster's importance in terms of our percentage of national business rates, these sort of capital schemes will be really important. So perhaps I'll stop there. I see that Ben has joined the call, which is good. Ben, we had to start without you.
I'm so sorry. It was in my I must be just a screw up with the Greenwich Mean Time +1. It was in my diary, obviously, for an hour later. I'm really, really sorry.
We're happy to see you, Ben.
Good morning. Good afternoon, Sydney.
So Ben, I already have introduced you. We just changed the order, so you're going last. We're really pleased to see you. We'd love your kind of overview thoughts on how things are going for London. And then the way this works is people will ask questions via the Zoom app, and I will sort through them, and we'll get into a discussion. So Ben,
right, okay, well, I'm so sorry, and I'm sorry not to hear the contributions from Westminster, and apologies again. I think there's some ways in which London clearly has been hardly hit, particularly hard hit. We're more than a third of the deaths in the UK, of which more than 20,000 have been in London. London is vulnerable in a number of ways. Most obviously, it is a business, well, it is a city where people live cheek by jowl, very much like Sydney. It's one of the best connected places in the world, so it's not surprising that the virus was quick to take off here. In terms of the broader impact on the city, is of course very much a business city. It's got by far the largest proportion of private sector or non-public sector workers in the country, and a huge number of those are in the sort of face-to-face hospitality and tourism industries. I mean, London, is well known for its restaurants and theatres and all of that. It has, of course, very high levels of poverty, and this is something that needs repeating, because there was an image out there, particularly I think across the rest of the country, that London is a city whose streets are paved with gold, and that it's had a very good, but of course we have very, very high levels of poverty, high levels of overcrowding, and all of those things make us particularly vulnerable. The other sort of special thing about London, which I think must count on the sort of vulnerability side, is the future of public transport in London. So the mayor, of course, as mayors have everywhere, has pretty much closed down the public transport system, and it's running at about less than 10% of its usual capacity. But what is unusual about the London transport system is the extent to which it relies gets almost no revenue funding from national government, and a huge proportion of its funding comes from the fare box. And it was already facing really tough financial challenges, and anything now or in the future which sees a really significant fall in fare box will have a sort of, almost like an existential threat on the future of public transport in the capital. The public transport city is, of course, one of our prides and joys. And the other reasons I think to be concerned, and why some of the reasons why government is going to be particularly worried, is because of the outsized role that London plays in the UK economy. And that role has grown more and more. Back in the 1970s, about 20% of GDP was produced in London. Now it's more like a third. So anything which hits London hard is going to hit the rest of the country hard. So those are sort of reasons I think to be. And the other thing about London is it has developed under successive mayors on a very, very sort of concentric model. And of course, Westminster is at the centre of all of that. There's been a lot of lip service paid to the idea of creating a sort of a polycentric city, but actually so much of the economic growth has been in the centre that anything which stops people moving into the centre is going to hit the economy hard. So those are all reasons why I think London is feeling vulnerable. On the positive sides, and I've been speaking a lot to public servants, and I'm sure my friends from Westminster will say the same. There's been a real sense of collaboration and people just putting aside the sort of all the sort of silos that you find in public services, and particularly I think perhaps in Britain, which has got a very centralised system of government, and where the barriers between, say, the health service and some of the services run by local authorities can be very, very profound. All those are gone. There's a sort of fantastic sense of sort of possibility and collaboration, people doing things in new ways, and people talking about making sure that when we go back to the new normal, we preserve some of that. And I just think, finally, Gabe, just sort of thinking a bit longer term, I remain, because I mean, I'm speaking a lot, not only to public servants, but to business people and urbanists, and they are really, really worried about what this will do to the future of London, and I guess to other cities around the world. And I should just sort of going to give some reasons for being optimistic and hopeful about the way in which we will recover from this. I think that in this great scheme of things in the history of cities, this all feels quite familiar. I mean, cities remain these extraordinarily successful inventions, and they are efficient, they're highly productive, and they've always had their sort of downsides. They've always had a few ugly problems: congestion, pollution, and disease. And well-run cities manage these things, and you can manage. We know you'll be able to, in the long term, manage Corona in the same way. We can talk a bit about how we'll do that and some of the measures we'll have to put in place, but I think it's possible. And some more sort of above that, some more sort of positive upsides, which I'm thinking about more and more. I mean, one is, I completely think that we will still have cities after this. People will still need to meet face to face. There's still lots of activities like going to the theatre or going to restaurants, you can only do face-to-face. But it has shown some real inefficiencies in the way in which we've been running our cities, which we can sort of now perhaps address. And the most obvious one is the way in which too many of us commute into the city centre on a daily basis, leaving our homes empty in the morning, imposing on the overstretched public transport system, leaving the offices empty at night. And it's going to make much more sense going forward where people can to do that less frequently. I think another real gain potentially is around actually our transport systems. Yes, people perhaps in the near future at least, perhaps a bit beyond that, will be traveling less by public transport. That will impose more pressures on the roads and streets. The only way of handling those pressures in a crowded city like London is going to be getting more people onto cycling and walking. And we're already beginning, and I don't know whether Westminster is doing this, but other boroughs are already beginning to convert pedestrian carriageway into cycling and pedestrian space. And I think the key thing there is just to maintain that afterwards and continue to promote modal shift towards active transport. And two very quick more things. One is that if people do move out of London, it'll largely be older people because they're most vulnerable to the virus. And that will just leave room for younger people to move in. And I'm afraid the truth is, and I say this as an older person now, younger people are very important for the dynamism of cities. And I think we just must recognize that demand for places like Westminster is massive, and most of it is currently unmet. And if some people move out and some businesses move out, there'll be no shortage of people and businesses wanting to move in. And my final point is that this will be certainly a huge boost to digital technology, whether that's using things like Zoom for us to convene or consuming online content as we're spending more time at home. But London and Sydney and New York and San Francisco are the centers of the tech industries in lots of ways, and they stand to benefit. London has a huge creative industries business, which will be providing the online content. And London has world-class institutions, whether it's museums or universities. And if you're going to move to a world where people are working and consuming more remotely, you have the whole world to choose from. And if you're going to watch a film, you're going to watch a show online, you're likely is not to watch it from a London theatre. If you're going to do an online university course, you're likely is not to do it from one of London's great universities. So, I think there are other trajectories which are negative, but I do think I'm speaking to so many people who are just sort of saying this is the end of our lives, the end of the city, the end of the London economy, and I'm not sure it is.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, there's a lot there for us to sift through. So everybody feel free to type your questions. Those of you who have been on these, I will probably not get to all of them, but we'll get to what we can. I may combine questions. Let me start with just, I guess, the basic question that the whole world has about the hotspots, so New York and London. Did the UK do anything wrong other than being slow to impose lockdown? Or is this just bad luck and things we don't really understand yet about the virus?
Who do you want to address that to?
Yeah, a good question. How are we going to run this? Well, look, Ben, why don't you start with that, and then we'll see who else wants to get in.
We were slow, certainly, and I think there was a bit of a sort of British, exceptionalism, where we thought we didn't have to perhaps follow the same rules as everyone else. And I do think sometimes some of the messaging from the centre has not been as sort of as powerful or as coherent as it could be. But I think if you want to look at the reasons why the UK has been very badly hit, and we might be the worst hit country in Europe, a lot of those are going to just be to do with our sort of very global nature, the high densities, particularly in London. So I think we were slow, but I think that was the main thing we've got wrong. And certainly having the NHS in lots of ways has been, it's come into its own. It runs well from the centre in some ways, and you've seen, nurses and doctors being moved around the country which you haven't seen in places like Italy. So I think there's been some good positive outcomes as well.
Rachael or Stuart, any opinions about why London has been hit so hard, other than being slow to impose lockdown?
Well, I think it's a bit early to say whether we were, to this or to that. So I wouldn't necessarily wish to, at this stage, say that, to say that we were too slow or too quick, or we should have done something differently. We have been hit hard. We are a very densely populated city. That was to be expected. I think there's been some real positives. The fact that within the NHS, as Ben has just mentioned, really immediate work to increase the capacity within urgent care areas, and the NHS has, despite initial concerns, has held up remarkably well. Indeed, we've also opened a series of these Nightingale hospitals, huge capacity hospitals, which we haven't needed, fortunately, as yet. That's the great success, that we haven't needed them, but they're there. So the point about creating capacity has been really positive. So I think, look, we're in an unprecedented circumstance. I think, I'm sure with hindsight, probably every city will be able to look back and say, well, if we'd done this 2 days earlier or 2 days later, maybe it would have, changed the course. I think, in fairness, we're all dealing with huge issues, and the government is trying, we are all trying to find the right balance between how we safeguard our economy, which, by the way, isn't just about numbers. It's what funds the health service. It's what drives all of us, as well as protecting lives. So there's a really critical balance. And let's also be clear that for us in the city, we are seeing increases in domestic violence. We're seeing real increases in things around mental health issues, suicide rates. There are real negatives to what we have had to impose. So this is not a cost-free option by any stretch of the imagination. And I think for any government, imposing lockdown is a really tough decision. It's not a binary, if we do this, it will save lives, because we know that there are increased cases of child abuse, no matter what we do to try and increase protection. There are cases of that, but as I said, domestic violence and all sorts of other negatives. So I think, I'm sure in time historians will have a field day with this, but all I think is we're all trying our best, really.
Good. Then picking up on your comment about transport. We're having the exact same conversation here in Sydney and every city that had a lot of public transport. One of the great ironies is that the public transport systems that were most efficient in terms of high fare box recovery rates will be the ones that are financially hit the hardest right now, whereas the public transport systems with low fare box recovery rates will continue to get their government funding and will be faced with less of a kind of immediate hit to business revenue. So in that sense, Sydney is faced with a less calamitous financial hit than TfL would be in the short run. Nevertheless, it is clear that in the short to medium run, people will be very reluctant to crowd back onto trains and buses. And of course, part of what made them so efficient was the crowding. So how far do you think London is going to get accelerating the shift to walking and bicycling? And I'm combining a bunch of questions that came in on transport here, but are you guys going to also do things to control the volumes of trips, like kind of non-voluntary transport demand management programs that desynchronize peak flows of passengers or things like that?
I think, I obviously those discussions are going on in TfL. I'd be surprised for as long as the virus is alive if we don't limit the number of people going onto our buses and trains. I'm sure there'll be some sort of version of social distancing, along with the use of face masks. And of course, where people don't feel confident about any of this, they're not going to go on public transport anyway. And in fact, I saw some polling recently which showed that the British were unusual amongst nations in the extent to which they said that they were both supporting lockdown and be unwilling to return to work or to return to social life at this point, even in its absence. I think the issue about transport funding in London is actually part of a slightly bigger issue, which is that London government is very, very underpowered relative to cities like New York or I think probably even Sydney, or certainly compared to the state. And particularly with regards to physical powers, so that almost all of our funding as a city comes from central government. And so when you get sort of a hit like this, which will hit not only fare revenue but obviously business rates as well, the city feels particularly sort of vulnerable. I mean, its funding system is very unresilient to this sort of thing. We're going to just have to go back to to the sort of kindness of central government and hope that, particularly as we've got a prime minister who was mayor of London, he and they dig deep. In terms of the sort of modal shift, I mean, we have, there's a glass half full and a glass half empty story in London. So we've seen almost a tripling of journeys taken by bike in the last sort of 20 years, which is great, but from an incredibly low base. So it's gone from about 1% to a bit more than 2.5% now, I think. And we'll just have to see. I mean, as I say, some boroughs are beginning to convert carriageway over to cycling and pedestrian lanes, but we'll need a much bigger push than that to make a difference. I think the real game changer here potentially is e-bikes. London's been very slow to embrace e-bikes. I hope that will change now, and this seems to me a real opportunity to say, right, we're going to get behind e-bikes, we're going to license them, we're going to promote them.
Yeah, good. Do you all think that London will become more affordable? If some people are moving out and that unmet latent demand to live in the center of one of the world's greatest cities becomes maybe more accessible, could that, do you think the dynamics could shift enough that you actually see London become more affordable?
Shall I hear from
Stuart, your views on that? Maybe start with you.
Well, I think it would be nice, wouldn't it? But I can tell you, look, we have, I mean, let me tell you just in Westminster's case, we have huge pressure on our housing, particularly affordable housing. We've got, if I tell you that just for Westminster City Council alone, we have over 4,000 families on our housing waiting list. And that is a huge pressure for an inner city area. So, house prices, it's a real challenge. It's really difficult also for the sort of what I call the middle segment, perhaps lower in middle income families. How on earth do you manage to afford to live in an inner city area like Westminster or indeed Camden or any of the other inner city areas when prices are so high? So we don't want a city which only the very rich or the very poor can live in. Cities like Westminster and indeed all London boroughs are really at the centre of trying to address this and deliver more affordable and more intermediate housing, which is that bit that's aimed at the middle. Whether this would have any significant difference, I'm not sure. But I suspect people will always want to live in the city, but let's see. Do you have anything?
No, you said it all.
All right, let's talk about high streets. You may know that the Committee for Sydney earlier this year put out a major report called Reclaiming Sydney High Streets. We believe they are just critically important to quality of life, and a source of joy and neighborhood identity, so many good things. Our recommendations were largely directed at the physical planning dimensions of that, about vehicle speeds and the width of footpaths and those dimensions. This pandemic is a real threat to the actual underlying health of the businesses. First of all, by accelerating the trend to online shopping, but second of all, because the businesses we all expected to take the place on the high streets, the experience businesses of bars and restaurants and cafes and yoga studios and gyms, are themselves not safe, are themselves going to be forced to impose social distancing, threatening their economic viability. What do we do? What do we do to make sure the high streets come out of this okay and can survive into the future?
Stuart or Rich, why don't you go first, because you're very close to this in Westminster.
Yeah, absolutely. Rachael spoke earlier about our Oxford Street project, and I think that's a really good example actually of where the leadership of the local authority in terms of bringing together the major landowners, people who can still afford to invest actually in the scheme, and working with those groups of people to better understand what the high street is going to need to look like going forward. And so we have, throughout the course of this pandemic, been engaging with those major landowners and talking to them about, as both Rachel and I have already said, not just about the immediate impact, but how together we come out of this over the medium to long term. And absolutely that place shaping responsibility that we have is going to be enormously important in the city's recovery and what the city is going to look like in the future as a result of this pandemic. So there is a lot of work that we are doing now, as I've already said, particularly using our convening and leadership role to try and provide that vision and design for what Westminster and our high streets are going to look like in the future. There's a lot of pressure on us, and I think, Gabriel, you mentioned some of these things around planning and licensing and being much more flexible in terms of the types of use that are allowed in various buildings. And I think that's absolutely right. It was something actually we were looking to do prior to the pandemic hitting, but it's even more acute now that we give that flexibility to industries who frankly know better than us what the future is and how they need to respond to this with our support, help and leadership.
Can I just add on that? Absolutely right. And just coming back to a point that Ben made earlier, I think there is an opportunity here to look at what is on our streets. And it is not necessarily residents in their cars anymore. It is much more freight, deliveries, commercial waste vehicles, etc. So what this might do, and it comes back to the point about how we address what is on our streets and ease that so that we've got more space for pedestrians and people to actually access the high streets. Maybe this gives us some leverage to accelerate that process to consolidate freight and delivery across our city. And that would ease the pressure on our streets, which would help us to work with the business improvement districts and the landowners in Westminster to improve the experience. And because we're absolutely with you, Gabriel, we need to protect our high streets. So maybe there are some opportunities. And if there's any time that we could actually crack this nut, perhaps now would be that time. I'm not saying we can, but we need to try.
Right.
I think that's right. Just to reiterate the point that we do in this country have what feels to me like a very inflexible licensing regime, and you sort of see that in places like Oxford Street and Regent Street. I mean, I've often thought, how strange it is that you walk down Oxford Street at 8 o'clock at night, the busiest, the most famous shopping street in the world, and it's completely dead because it's only the only license for retail and not for restaurants and things, and there's another sort of vision of Oxford Street, over the next 5 years, where you really sort of rethink the whole thing. You really do pedestrianize it, and you allow a lot more pop-up activity and meanwhile use, and you've got your young art students who aren't actually so worried about coronavirus working on the sort of upper floors of the shops that are closed, and this is a chance to sort of really, I think, actually create a sort of much more lively, potentially, place in centre of London, where there will be demand, in outer London, where the high streets are, very different and much more like high streets up and down the country. I think your points, Gabe, are really well made about actually paying. Most of the debate in this country is about just business rates and what can we do to relieve the burden of business rates on high streets. I think that's a small part of it. I think it is about making sure that they're well designed, that they're attractive, and getting businesses in there who've got a long-term stake and a sort of and a connection to the local residents. And too many of our high streets are still occupied by quite low value chains with no real relationship to the area. And I think we really sort of got to change that and sort of start thinking about how do you create actually what town centres used to be, which was generally sort of community centres and community hubs with sort of links into the local areas, and not just a sort of not just a sort of retail opportunity.
Yeah. So one of the first most obvious things is to be permissive about what happens, but then after that it gets we're gonna have to all be really creative about this, aren't we? We're gonna watch what you do very carefully.
And likewise.
A couple of questions about the future of office space have come in. Very big cultural and economic questions for Sydney as for London. These economic powerhouses of their nations bring lots and lots of people together to work in office buildings. If people don't want to come to work as often, as many days a week, which of course would be a good thing from a mobility demand perspective, if people need to have more space between them when they work, if people aren't sure if they want to sit at a desk where somebody else sat the day before, if people aren't sure that they want to crowd into a small conference room together, how does office space work moving into the future, and what does that mean for London?
Well, I mean, if I was a landlord or developer or workspace provider, I would be pretty worried in the short term. But as an urbanist, I actually see the upsides in what could be a much more efficient use of space. And after all, cities are all about efficiency. And if we get to a position where people are coming into the office only 1 or 2 days a week for those essential meetings and the sort of the socializing that I think we do need to do, and we'll always need to do face to face, that can only be a win. And it will mean that there'll be more businesses that can operate out of the centre of London with all the benefits of being at the centre of a world city. It might free up a bit of space for more housing. So I think it's really obviously incredibly important to distinguish between the short term and the sort of medium term. In the medium term, it is probably medium term because it's 2 or 3 years away. We'll have a vaccine, and I think we'll be surprised by at that point, how much life goes back in many ways to the way it was before. But I just hope in the meantime we've managed to retain some of the sort of positive gains and turn a challenge to an opportunity.
Yeah.
The only thing, Gabriel, if you don't mind, I'd add to that, and I think this certainly in the short to medium term ties back to your question earlier about transport, because London, more than anywhere else, we have jobs here that people can work remotely or from home. I think the estimate is just over 60% of people who work in London can work remotely or from home, and that is going to be a big part of how the transport networks open up again, given the reliance on public transport of commuters into London. So the balancing act for TfL, for us, for businesses in London, is going to be how we manage that return to public transport, bearing in mind that people can now work differently, and office space will have to be occupied differently in the future as well.
And if I just add to that, of course, Gabe, that potentially will be very good for outer London town centres, because if you've got more people working from home, they'll be spending more money locally. And you might see that might be a real boost to some of those struggling out of town, sort of outer London town centres and high streets.
Yeah. A question about tourism. Of course, in Australia, where the country has done such a good job flattening the curve, whether by luck or by design, can be debated, but Australia is starting the process of gradually reopening, but no one can come here. And that means a lot of trouble for many sectors of the economy that depend on international travel. How is that going to affect London? What do you do to mitigate that? If there's a time period where London starts to reopen, but international travel does not?
I'm not sure how we mitigate it. All I can tell you is that it will have a huge impact. So for Westminster, I think it's about 2/3 of theatre tickets are sold to tourists. So, you know, you take, and, you know, our restaurants, our cafes, all of the things that, you know, our museums, so much of the drivers of Westminster economies are based on tourism. So we can do, you know, there are things that we could potentially do to mitigate it, but I'm afraid if you haven't got the tourist footfall, it's really difficult. And Stuart and I were just talking just before this call, we have a great event, West End Live, which happens each year in Trafalgar Square. If you're ever here in June, you should try and go to it. It's fantastic. It's a free showcase of all theatre and musicals in Trafalgar Square. It's a fantastic driver for the theatre sector. But of course, we've cancelled it from June. We were going to hold it in October. I think it's highly unlikely we'll be able to hold it in October. And so when will that come back to normal? And it's going to be a real problem. And even for, you know, someone said the other day that we both know who's had a really bad bout of coronavirus, and he said, you know, I can't see myself going to the theatre for a long time because how closely people sit together. So all I can say is we are acutely aware of the impact that a lack of tourism will cause us in the centre of Westminster, and it's going to be really difficult.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, that this seems to be a huge. I think we will see a big switch from where people can travel by high-speed train rather than by plane. That doesn't actually help London probably as much as it does some European cities, which are much better connected by rail. But I would expect to see, a big switch to train travel away from over cars, over planes.
Right, but maybe within Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we get to go to New Zealand, so that'll be great too. All right. We are about at the end of our time. I want to thank you so much for getting up early and joining us for a little Sydney-London conversation. We are watching you very closely.
Likewise.
And I can't wait to come to London again whenever I'm allowed. But thank you.
I'm sorry again about being.
Thank you very much.
No problem. We're glad you made it. Everyone, this has been Committee for Sydney Live, and we will see you for the next one. All right, goodbye.